In the part 2 of this lecture, we'll focus more on the structure and the functions of hemoglobin. So aside from the alpha and the beta chains, hemoglobin can actually come with other subunits such as the delta and the gamma subunits. So in normal adults, about 97% of our red blood cells contain HbA, or the adult form of hemoglobin, that comes with 2 alpha and the 2 beta chains, while the remaining 3% will have HbA2, which is the variant of the adult form of hemoglobin that is composed of 2 alpha chains and 2 delta chains. So for people with thalassemia, this ratio could be a bit different. Now, how about fetus? For fetus, they have HbF, or the fetal hemoglobin, which is composed of 2 alpha chains and 2 gamma chains, while fetus could also have up to 2% of the adult form of hemoglobin. So my question is, which form of hemoglobin do you think has the strongest affinity towards oxygen? Is it HbA, A2, or HbF? Well, the answer is HbF. That's because fetus will require oxygen extraction from her mother's blood. So for any kind of subunit, each of them is having a heme group consisting of a porphyrin ring in the center. So in the porphyrin ring, you will find one center ion. So with one hemoglobin, you will get 4 polypeptides or 4 porphyrin rings. As a result, one hemoglobin can bind up to 4 oxygen. Okay, here is a diagram of a hemoglobin. So do you think, is it a HbA, A2, or a HbF? Well, the answer is, it is a HbA, as you have got 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. And shown in this diagram, you have the 3D structure of hemoglobin that can be downloaded from the protein data bank. So very clearly, you can see that the predominant secondary structures are alpha helices, right? While in the center of each of these subunits, you have the heme group that's containing a center ion, which allows the binding of up to 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen molecules. Zooming further to the heme group, you will find an ion coordinated in the center of the porphyrin ring by 4 nitrogen atoms. So where else can you find such functional group? Well, you can also find heme group in myoglobin that is found in your muscle tissues. Since each ion can only bind up to 1 oxygen reversibly, one hemoglobin can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules with 4 heme groups. And because oxygen is poorly dissolved in water, so 98.5% of the oxygen must be carried by the hemoglobin in the blood, while the rest, 1.5%, will be carried by the plasma. And because hemoglobin is a colored compound, it is basically a pigment, and it changes color when it is bound to oxygen. So when it is bound to oxygen, or when it is oxygenated, it becomes reddish in color, while when it is deoxygenated, it becomes bluish in color. So you have learned that hemoglobin is responsible for the majority of oxygen transport around the body, and there are 2 factors governing the ability of hemoglobin to bind to oxygen. Number 1 is the partial pressure of oxygen, which is PO2. We'll discuss it more details later. While factor number 2 is the number of free oxygen binding sites on the hemoglobin molecule. So whenever oxygen is bound with the hemoglobin, it has now become an oxyhemoglobin. And now to digress a little bit, we know that Kenyans, they are really good runners, as they are the record breakers for most 100-meter run, they are record breakers for even long marathon runs and so on. But why is that so? Well, here is a common argument. First of all, Kenya is a relatively poor country and they are lacking in infrastructure. So kids used to run around in the village, so they receive early training. Well, a second reason is more valid for me because Kenya is a mountainous country. As you can see from their map, about half of the country is comprised of mountains as high as 4,000 meters. So with increased altitude, we know that the oxygen partial pressure is dropping. So as a result, Kenyans have more red blood cells in order to compensate for the drop in oxygen levels. And this explains why they are natural good runners. Okay, in this diagram, you can see the relationship in between partial pressure of oxygen on the x-axis versus the degree of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin on the y-axis. So when the PO2 is almost maximal in your lungs or in your alveoli, which is about 100 millimeter mercury, you can see that hemoglobin is almost 100% saturated with oxygen. But in your resting tissues, when you have a lower PO2 level at 40 millimeter mercury, the hemoglobin is about 75% saturated with oxygen. In other words, only 25% of the oxygen has been released. But during exercise, when you have an even lower PO2 level, you can see that more oxygen can be released. So it is important for hemoglobin not just able to bind to oxygen, but to able to release it as well. Besides oxygen, hemoglobin can also bind to carbon dioxide. So about 1/4 or 23% of your carbon dioxide in the veins are carried on hemoglobin, but the affinity is much lower than oxygen. And therefore, most carbon dioxide is dissolved in blood plasma, forming the bicarbonate buffer system. This system is crucial in maintaining our blood pH value. Carbon monoxide, on the other hand, can bind irreversibly to hemoglobin, forming carboxyhemoglobin, and it does so with an affinity 200 times stronger than the oxygen. So when this happens, that person is going to suffer from a brain damage or die of suffocation. So people actually committed suicide by inhaling carbon monoxide, and you can see that their skins and even internal organs will become bright red in color. That is the color of carboxyhemoglobin. In the following section, we'll look at some abnormalities in the production of hemoglobin. So there are two types of, or two classes of blood inherited disorders. The first one are hemoglobinopathies, which means you have disease in the production of globin proteins. In other words, you have abnormal globin chains production, such as in the case of sickle cell anemia. While in the thalassemia, these globin chains are perfectly normal, but they're produced in a smaller quantity, or they are totally absent due to some mutations that affects the level of gene expression. So for information, there are 4 genes encoding the alpha globin, while there are 2 genes encoding the beta globins. So whenever mutations happen at these genes, you might have a decreased production of these proteins. Let's take a look at the sickle cell anemia. It is very common with the F. Okay, sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation from glutamic acid into valine on a gene encoding the beta chain. And with that, this mutated form of hemoglobin is known as HbS, which tend to stick together, forming crystals. And this leads into this sickle cell shape of the red blood cells. So you actually learned this from me in my biochemistry lecture. So with this sickle cell shape, red blood cells tend to trap within the blood vessels, causing ischemia or infarction, which means the lack of blood supply that can kill the tissue. And here are more hypotheses on how sickle cell anemia confers resistance against malaria. We are unsure of how it works, but it seems that the infested red blood cell have a lower oxygen tension or a lower oxygen partial pressure. Therefore, the infected cells are likely to be killed by phagocytosis. On the other hand, the sickle trait of red blood cells also produces higher levels of reactive oxygen species like the superoxide and the hydrogen peroxide molecules, which can also kill the parasites. And next, we'll look at the thalassemias. It is most common in the Mediterranean and the Indian region, while in Malaysia, about 1 in 20 people are the carriers of thalassemia. With thalassemia, there could be more than 100 types of genetic mutations, but there are generally 2 possible causes of thalassemia. It is either a gross deletion of 1 or more globin genes, or it could be any mutation that affects the genetic expression level of these globin genes. So in alpha thalassemia, the production of the alpha globin chain is deficient, while for the beta thalassemia, the production of the beta globin chain is deficient as well. So the severity of this disease is totally depending on the type of mutation and how many genes have been affected by the mutations. So to give you a better idea on thalassemias, let's look at these several examples. In alpha thalassemia, because the production of alpha globin is affected or is being reduced, you have an excess of beta chains. So this leads to an unstable tetramer formation. We call it hemoglobin H. And you can check the impact by looking at the oxygen dissociation curve of this HbH. While for the beta thalassemia, On the other hand, you have an excess of alpha chains, but these do not form tetramers. Instead, they bind to the red blood cell membranes, producing membrane damage, and that could even form toxic aggregates at high concentrations. So because patients with severe thalassemia require frequent blood transfusion, they can also get an overload of iron when the red blood cells break down, releasing the iron. This can lead to organ damage impacting heart, liver, or even the endocrine system due to the deposits of iron in the endocrine glands. And they will need iron chelation therapy to extract iron out from the body. For more information, please refer to this website produced and maintained by the Ministry of Health of Malaysia. And it is particularly important if you're going to get married and get pregnant in future. So for example, with different people, different races, you will get different prevalence of thalassemia. Now, for example, Sabah has the highest number of thalassemia in Malaysia, while in Peninsular Malaysia, Malays account for the majority of thalassemia. So if you yourself is a carrier, there could be risk marrying to another carrier and risking having children who are the patients of thalassemia. So you have to decide based on your knowledge on the genetic makeup of both parents. And here is a video that you can watch to improve your understanding on the sickle cell disease. To summarize, we have talked about the constituents of blood, which comprise of blood plasma and all kinds of blood cells. We have also talked about the functions of blood, which are mainly for transportation of gases and chemicals across the body. We have also looked at the structure and functions of hemoglobin and how can genetic mutation leads to heritable blood disorder such as the sickle cell anemia and the thalassemias.